Sometimes we try to avoid certain places. If you live in Hampton, you might try to avoid Route 1 in a month or so when the holiday weekend comes up. But there are places that feel unstable or maybe unsafe or too crowded, unpredictable or maybe dangerous. Some places where tensions are high, emotions run deep, and opposition is real. Most people spend their lives trying to stay safe, avoiding conflict, avoiding risk, and avoiding discomfort. But the gospel of Jesus has a way of leading us into some dangerous spaces and to minister to some dangerous people. Not reckless places, but spiritually dangerous places where people are divided or they are deluded, they believe lies, places where the messenger might be violently rejected or even murdered. Today it seems like there's a lot of wars over words. In Acts 14, Paul the Apostle and Barnabas entered two different cities. Well, they enter three, but we're only going to talk about the first two. And in these cities, we're going to see three kinds of danger in the first two cities they go to. And the truth for us today is if we're serious about serving Jesus, we can't avoid every danger or every discomfort. And sometimes we have to go out of our comfort zone to do what God's telling us to do. Sometimes you have to talk to that person you don't want to talk to. But we can remain faithful in all circumstances. So we will start at verse 1 of Acts chapter something. 15, does it say? 14. Acts 14:1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual to the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. So we see that they have a consistent mission. Wherever they go talk about Jesus. And they usually start in the Jewish synagogue. So it says, as usual, they went to the synagogue. They stayed committed to their calling, despite the fact that they had trouble in the last synagogue. They went to another. Faithfulness means consistency, even when the results may vary. And in this one, there was a powerful message with a powerful effect. They spoke so effectively, it says, that the gospel produced belief in a number of Jews and Greeks. They were reaching both types of people. And the power is not in the messenger, but in the message. These missionaries had not given up on reaching Jews and God-fearing Gentiles through the synagogue, even though we read in the last chapter where they said, now we're turning to the Gentiles. That doesn't mean they're leaving the Jews behind, but it means they're also going after the Gentiles. The gospel message was blessed to cause many to believe, both Jews and Greeks, at the synagogue in Iconium. And then it says they started to work against them right away in Acts 14:2. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. So you see that division. Some are with the Jews, some are backing the apostles. And they don't know which one to go with. It's interesting how they turned that phrase, they were poisoning the minds of the Gentiles. So they were saying a lot of bad things about Paul and Barnabas and untrue things about them. And the opposition grew, and that unbelief led to hostility because when minds were poisoned, then the city became divided. To those who believed the truth and those who took the poison, who believed the poison, believed the lies, I guess you'd say, right? And something interesting about the gospel, we think about how the gospel saves and it brings us together with other believers, but in some ways it also separates and makes us now the prey for the unbelievers to criticize, to ridicule. Those who heard and rejected the gospel of Christ raised a fierce opposition against Paul and Barnabas. But despite the opposition, they just go right on working. They go right on preaching. Paul and Barnabas stayed there in Iconium, and they continued preaching Jesus. And it says God was confirming the message of grace. And I like that phrase. It doesn't say he was preaching grace, but that's what it means, right? God confirmed the message of grace by giving signs and wonders. Now, we don't know what those were in Iconium. They'll mention a specific one in Lystra. But in Iconium, we don't know exactly what the signs and wonders were. I assume they were healings and miracles. But faith is based in the Word of God. People believed the Word about Jesus and they were saved. And it's in the grace of God. It's not based on miracles, but miracles can certainly strengthen the faith that we have, can't they? So I think the signs served as a counterbalance, the signs and wonders on this side of the apostles, and over here with the unbelieving Jews was the poisoning of the minds. So you have the poisoning of the minds, and then you have the signs and wonders. And that makes you question, well, there has to be something about this, doesn't there? Because God's hand is obviously on these people. And yet you're telling me all these bad things about them. So the signs served as a counterbalance for the opposition and giving them favor among the people. Because the Holy Spirit was working and the gospel was going forth, they just kept ministering to the city in spite of the opposition. And it was a courageous perseverance. It says they stayed a considerable time. Now, we don't know exactly how long that was, but it's supposed to mean a long time, I think. They spoke boldly despite the resistance, and God confirmed his message with signs and wonders. And then we read in verse 5 through 7, there was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews, so they were coming together and plotting together with their leaders to mistreat them and stone them. To stone them meant to pick up stones and throw at them until they died. But they found out about it. The apostles found out about the plan. The church found out about the plan. And it says they fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. Sometimes for the missionaries, it's time to leave. This was a necessary departure because the plot turned deadly. First they were divided, and then they were deadly. And they fled. And this was not cowardice, but it was wisdom. There are some times when you stand firm, and they did, it says, for a considerable time. And then there's some times when you leave, because if we're the distraction, we'll get out of the way, the apostles think. There's people who are going to believe that are going to continue, and the church is going to continue to grow. There's never a time to stop preaching the gospel, but sometimes there's time to move on. The opposition found it difficult making progress against the message and the miracles. So they decided we need to get rid of the missionaries. We need to get rid of these mouthpieces. The plans were made by Jews and Gentiles together, their intention to stone them. But the plot was revealed, and Paul and Barnabas decided to move on. The opposition could throw them out of Antioch. They had, remember? And now they could plot their death in Iconium, which they're doing, but they could not stop them from preaching Jesus to people. They were not ashamed of the gospel, They were not afraid of their enemies, but I believe they were led of the Lord to move on out of Antioch. And it's going to be kind of evident when they go into Lystra that God had led them to go there. So we begin in verse 8. In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed. And he called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. There's no mention of a synagogue in Lystra. And the healing of the lame man takes place where Paul was going and Barnabas were going to share the gospel, and that would have been a public concourse like the meeting in the marketplace in the city. The Hampton gazebo. I mean, trying to think of a good example here. We don't really have a good concourse, do we, here in Hampton? But anyway, this is where Paul chose to begin preaching in Lystra, and this is where the lame man had chosen to be begging in the public place, because that's where the people were. And as Paul was preaching, he saw the lame man, and it was probably obvious that he was lame because he wasn't on his feet. And he probably had a cup where he was, taking donations, alms for the poor. But as Paul was preaching, his eye fell on the lame man, and they made a connection. Now, this has happened to me sometimes in preaching a message, that you look out and you see one person looking at you, and either they can be really happy, they can be smiling, they can be happy, or they can be crying, like they're being impacted somehow by the word. But anyway, Paul saw something when he looked at the lame man who had chosen this place to beg. And the lame man was listening to Paul preaching. He'd come to get some money, but he was hearing something he had never heard. He was hearing that in Jesus, you could find grace and mercy and forgiveness of sins. And he was also healing people, and the lame man needed to be healed. But he listened as Paul was preaching, and Paul's eye fell on him. Something about the way he looked and the way he listened. Paul could see that there was faith in that man, that he had faith to believe the message of Jesus. He had faith to be saved by the gospel of Jesus, and he also had faith to be healed. The word Paul was preaching produced faith in the lame man. Faith through grace brought to this man a physical healing and a spiritual healing. Faith came through the word, and healing followed his belief. When Paul sees him and he knows God's doing something in this person's heart right now, it says he raised his voice so that all could hear him say to the lame man, "Stand up on your feet." I bet that got everybody's attention, didn't it? For the first time in his life, it says he jumped up and began to walk. Something he had never been able to do and therefore never learned to do, but he was walking. If you lose your strength in your legs, you have to learn to walk again, right? Even if you knew how to walk before, you have to learn to walk again. And they put you in rehab. And they put little bars on the sides, and you walk between the bars, Well, there's this guy who has not been walking in his entire life. He jumps up and he's walking. And I believe that God is still looking for people who will listen and accept his word with faith. Believe what he says. And then we have the misguided crowd. This is what I was going to say is, they were a divided city, but now they're going to become something else. They're going to become a diluted city. Verse 11 to 13, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian tongue, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and rhees to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. So not only did they not have a synagogue, but they did have a temple for Zeus, a place where you could worship one of the Greek gods and probably some others. The crowd misunderstood the miracle, and they replaced the truth with superstition. They tried to worship the men instead of worshiping God. And people who reject the truth may attempt to replace it with error. The superstitious crowd thought the gods had come to visit them, and they were performing miracles. So they identified Barnabas and Paul as Zeus and Hermes. I would say the missionaries, Paul and Barnabas, did not understand what the crowd was saying initially, or what they were calling them initially, because it says they were speaking the Lycaonian tongue. It's a local dialect that they probably wouldn't be familiar with. But they knew something was up. Something got their attention is when the priest of Zeus comes walking toward them with some wreaths he's probably wanting to put on their neck, and with a bull that he's planning to sacrifice. They knew something was up then. So it says they corrected them. They made a faithful correction, verse 14 through 18. When the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes, rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony." Well, that's a lot of verses, isn't it? "He has shown by kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. See, they got it in their heads. We're gonna have a celebration of the gods who are among us. And Paul and Barnabas refused to accept worship or sacrifices because they were not gods. They did stop the sacrifices from being made to them, and Paul and Barnabas rejected their worship. And they pointed instead to, we were telling you about the Creator, the living God, who made all things, and these things are worthless. So basically they were telling the priest of Zeus, you are a worthless priest. And they're telling the pagans in the city of Iconium, they're telling them, in Lystra, they're telling them, your gods are nothing. Your gods don't deserve worship. It must have thrown them back when what they thought were gods told them, we're not worthy of worship. We're human like you, and you shouldn't be worshiping any gods except one. They insulted their pagan religion by calling Zeus and Hermes worthless things. They're just the gods of your human imagination. There's only one true God, and his goodness and his greatness is seen in all of his creation. Well, in any case, it was an anticlimax, right, for the crowd. We're getting ready to have a worship service. We're getting ready to sacrifice the bulls. They were embarrassed. and they looked foolish. They probably felt foolish. And their worship was refused, their theology insulted. And Satan saw this as a pretty good opportunity to try to get rid of that Apostle Paul, get rid of that dangerous man. And he brought a crowd not only of people from Lystra, but people from Antioch as well, outsider opposition, to help sway the crowd against Paul. Verse 19, then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. Who does he think he is to make fun of our gods? Your gods. The Jews were working with the Gentiles, but they didn't believe what the Gentiles believed, right? And this is where the deluded city became the deadly city. It's interesting, isn't it? It's fascinating. These two guys come in, they're preaching the gospel, they do the miraculous healing, and in 1 minute, the crowd is ready to bow down and worship them as gods have come down to the earth. And then the same crowd, in the next minute, or maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, I don't know, but soon after, the same crowd who wanted to bow down to them says, let's kill them. They were ready to stone him to death. The word thinking, they drug him outside the city. After they stoned him, they drug him outside the city thinking he was dead. I think we have to talk about thinking. Thinking does not mean they assumed he was dead. Like we use the word thought, well, it means we thought something. It doesn't mean it was true. But the Greek word here is nemizo, and it means to conclude from custom, law, or evidence. It never means, we suppose he's dead. It would mean, he's dead. Like when the centurions crucified Jesus, and they said, make sure he's dead. Then the centurion said, oh, he's dead. He stabbed him in the side, water came out his side, water and blood. He said, he's dead. And they looked at Paul, and they said, yeah, he's dead. You can throw big stones at somebody and hit them and they don't move, they don't flinch, they don't yell, they're dead. It never means to imagine or suppose. The crowd had no doubt that Paul was dead, and I would say, I believe he was. Although it's not absolutely clear in Acts, I believe it's pretty clear he was dead. A sudden reversal when the crowd turned against Paul and killed him. Outside opposition influenced public opinion, and public approval is often very shallow and short-lived. They're always talking about the approval rating of a politician, right? It's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. Or then it's down, down, down. A violent attack where Paul was stoned and left for dead. That sometimes is the cost of a faithful ministry. And I wonder when Paul was being stoned if he remembered Stephen. Remember earlier in Acts, Paul was there when Stephen was stoned, and he was on the other side holding the coats of people throwing stones. But I would like to link Paul's stoning to a passage he wrote later in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1 to 4. There he's talking about the things he's been through for Jesus, and he said, I must go on boasting, although there is nothing to gain. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. Verse 2. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. You hear what Paul's saying? He says, whether I was alive or dead, I'm not sure. Whether I was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. I think he had an out-of-the-body experience. You've heard people talk about that before, right? And he was taken to heaven and he saw things he said, I'm not allowed to tell you. I'm just not allowed to talk about. Perhaps this is why, after his violent attack, and the believers are gathered around Paul, he came back to life and he got up and went right back into the city. And the next day he left for Derbe. He was not slowed down or deterred because he'd seen the end of the way. He'd got a glimpse of heaven. If Stephen, when he was stoned, said, I see Jesus standing at the Father's right hand, Paul didn't say that. But I think Jesus would be standing for Paul just like he was for Stephen. He got up and went back to the city, verse 20. After the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back to the city, and the next day he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Let that sink in. He died, but he didn't quit. He didn't retreat. He went back to Lystra. And the next day, he moved on to Derbe, where the mission continued. He and Barnabas, the mission continued. Next day, Paul and Barnabas head to another town. Now, it would be a miracle to me, I believe, that a man who was stoned and left for dead got up and went into the city after that. But even more so, that he began the very next day a long and arduous journey to Derbe. A difficult journey, we are told geographically, to make that journey. And what happens in Derbe? Well, we'll talk about that one next week. But the gospel led Paul and Barnabas into a divided city where they were opposed, a deluded city where they were misunderstood, and a deadly city, let's just say where at least Paul was nearly killed or nearly killed. And yet they kept on going. Why? Because they believed the message of Jesus they were preaching was worth it. If it costs me my life, it's worth it. Today, I don't think any of us are in danger of being stoned in the near future. You might be if you went on a mission trip to some countries. You might be beheaded. But we do face division, like Paul and Barnabas faced. Division is cultural, political, spiritual, lots of division. We face delusion. There are so many people who are confused about Jesus. And they're trying to find a spirituality or a path to God or a path to the divine without Jesus. They're deluded. And some of them are, there is, I say we may not be in danger. There are churches where gunmen have came in and shot people who were worshiping in the church. That has happened in America more than once, and with an alarming frequency, actually. But here's the challenge is, we need to serve Jesus in the space, whether it is safe or dangerous. We need to serve Jesus. Dangerous places like that very difficult conversation, that coworker or that resistant family member, a hostile workplace, a spiritually confused culture. The gospel is so important that we must share it. And maybe God is calling some of you to step into a space that you've been avoiding. Maybe there's a person he wants you to speak to Jesus about. And I think today it would be good if we could say, Lord, I'll go wherever and to whoever you want. Wherever, to whoever you send me. Even if I'm afraid it might cost me something, I'll still try. So we do need to be faithful, risking our lives at times. We're not often called to lay down our life, but Jesus has done that. So.